Is the Maniza project the final piece to Zimbabwe's economic puzzle? Well, everything points to that if case studies are anything to go by. Now, it shows that countries with big iron and steel productions are showcasing this. This project by Dinson Iron and Steel Company has already been projected to become Africa's single best manufacturer of such commodities. So how will that impact on Zimbabwe's construction, mining and agricultural industries? We get more from the following report.
Shame, shame. Shame, we say, to the United States of America. Shame, 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 we say, to Britain and its allies.
Last year, Robert...
Mr. Trump, please blow your trumpet. Blow your trumpet in a musical way towards the values of unity, peace, cooperation, togetherness, dialogue, which we have always stood for and which are well written in our very sacred document, the Charter of the United Nations.
The night the furnaces of Zimbabwe's steel plant first came alive, the sky above Hwange glowed bright orange, a beacon that could be seen for miles. To some, it was just molten metal being forged. But to others, it was the sight of a continent waking up, shaking off centuries of exploitation, and forging its future with fire. For decades, Zimbabwe was painted as the cautionary tale of Africa: sanctions, economic collapse, hyperinflation. Western analysts dismissed it as a failed state. But as those first streams of liquid steel flowed, it became clear that Zimbabwe had pulled off what its critics swore was impossible: the largest and most advanced steel plant on African soil. Built without Western blessing, without IMF loans, without Washington's green light. And that right there is why America is worried, because this is not just a factory. This is a declaration of war against dependency, a challenge to the world order that has kept Africa in chains for over a century. Washington didn't see this coming. Their intelligence reports didn't predict that Zimbabwe would find financing from Beijing, engineering expertise from Mumbai, and regional support from the African Union. They thought sanctions would choke Zimbabwe into submission. Instead, those sanctions forced Zimbabwe to innovate, to partner with nations who weren't interested in lecturing them but in building with them. And now the US is facing its worst nightmare: an Africa that doesn't need them. Imagine the implications: bridges built with African steel, railways connecting African cities, factories assembling African cars, and ships sailing under African flags. Every ton of steel produced at this plant is one less ton imported from the West. Every job created in Zimbabwe is one less dependent on Western aid. This plant isn't just producing steel, it's producing confidence, sovereignty, and power. It's telling African leaders, you can do this too, and that message is spreading. Already, leaders from Ghana, Kenya, and Nigeria are visiting the site, signing moose, and preparing to replicate this success in their own countries. That terrifies Washington, because for the first time, Africa has a blueprint for true independence, not just political independence, but economic independence. The Western media is trying to spin it, calling it risky, warning about debt traps, claiming it will pollute the environment, but nobody is buying it. Not after decades of Western corporations plundering Africa's resources without a second thought. This steel plant is not just an industrial achievement, it is a symbol that Africa has moved past begging for handouts and is now demanding a seat at the table of global power. America can feel the shift. This is why analysts in Washington are panicking, warning of geopolitical consequences, of a potential loss of influence in Africa. They're right to panic, because this is bigger than Zimbabwe. This is the spark that will ignite Africa's industrial revolution. When future historians write about the moment Africa truly broke free from neocolonialism, they won't talk about speeches or summits, they will talk about this: the day the furnaces of Zimbabwe roared to life and Africa stopped asking for permission. The US can either accept this new reality or watch as Africa builds its own future. One beam, one bridge, one railway at a time without them. This is not just Zimbabwe's victory. It is Africa's declaration of independence this time, an independence built on steel. The world woke up to news that shook boardrooms from Washington to Brussels. Zimbabwe, a country the West had written off as struggling, just launched Africa's largest steel plant worth $800 million. This was not just another factory. This was a declaration of independence. It was a statement that Africa was no longer content with being a supplier of cheap raw materials for Western industries, but was ready to process, refine, and manufacture its own wealth. For decades, steel has been the backbone of every global superpower. The United States, Europe, Japan, and China all rose to dominance on the back of massive steel production. Steel is not just metal, it is tanks, railways, bridges, skyscrapers, cars, ships, and military power. And for years, Africa's iron ore and other raw materials were shipped overseas to fuel Western economies, leaving African nations with crumbs. That era is ending. Zimbabwe's steel plant is more than a facility. It is a weapon of economic transformation. It represents Africa saying to the world, we will no longer sell our iron ore for pennies only to import it back as expensive machinery. We will build our own. We will cut out the middlemen who have drained our wealth for centuries, and we will keep the profits here, where they belong in African hands. The $800 million investment was not funded by the World Bank or IMF. It was not tied to suffocating conditionalities that force nations into austerity. Instead, this project was built through African ingenuity, partnerships with friendly nations like China, and a clear political will to break free from dependency. That is what truly terrifies Washington. Because if Zimbabwe succeeds, and it will, then every other African nation will follow. Imagine Nigeria building massive steel plants to supply its own automotive industry. Imagine Ghana, Angola, and Burkina Faso no longer exporting raw minerals but processing them at home. Imagine an Africa that no longer has to beg for infrastructure loans because it can build its own bridges and railways at a fraction of the cost. Washington knows what this means. It means losing control. It means losing leverage. It means losing trillions in profits that used to flow out of Africa every year. The U.S. does not fear Zimbabwe as steel because it is a threat militarily. It fears Zimbabwe as steel because it is a threat economically. The Western media is already in panic mode. Headlines scream about Chinese influence and geopolitical risks. But what they will not admit is that this is not about China, it is about Africa choosing to stand tall. The West cannot comprehend an Africa that does not kneel. Inside closed-door meetings, Washington strategists are asking the same question. What happens when Africa no longer needs us? For decades, U.S. corporations treated Africa as a market for finished goods and a source of cheap resources. This steel plant flips the table. Now Africa can manufacture its own construction materials, build its own industries, and even export finished steel to neighboring nations and beyond. The ripple effect will be massive. Local employment will skyrocket as thousands of skilled and unskilled workers find jobs. Zimbabwe's GDP will see a surge. Infrastructure projects that were once delayed due to high import costs will move faster. African nations that used to spend billions importing steel will now turn to Zimbabwe, keeping wealth circulating within the continent. This is what Washington fears: the beginning of an Africa-first economy, an economy that no longer depends on Western loans and Western approval, an economy that builds African power rather than Western dominance. And let us not forget the symbolism of steel itself. Steel is strength. Steel is unbreakable. Steel is the foundation of power. For Zimbabwe to control its own steel means it is controlling its future. No longer will a Western embargo or sanction cripple its development projects. No longer will foreign suppliers dictate prices and timelines. Zimbabwe holds the hammer, and it will strike its own destiny. Some critics will say this is just one plant, just one project. But those critics do not understand history. The United States became an industrial giant not because of one steel mill, but because it dared to build them when others said it couldn't. Zimbabwe's move is the first domino, and soon others will fall. Already, whispers are spreading across Africa. In Nigeria, lawmakers are calling for renewed investment in their Ajakuta steel project. In Ghana, there are talks about building a West African steel consortium. In South Africa, labor unions are demanding government policies that favor local production over cheap imports. The Zimbabwe plant is inspiring a movement, a steel revolution, and as that movement grows, so too will Western anxiety. Because Africa is no longer waiting for permission to rise. Africa is no longer asking politely for development. Africa is taking it. When the furnaces of Zimbabwe's steel plant roared to life, the noise was more than just the sound of molten metal being forged, it was the sound of history being made. It was the sound of Africa refusing to stay silent any longer. Every ton of steel that leaves that plant carries with it a message. We will not be exploited. We will not be ignored. We will not be stopped. Washington's first reaction was disbelief. How could a country under sanctions, a country that Western economists claimed was broke, find the capital and technical expertise to build something so ambitious? They quickly found their answer: partnership. Zimbabwe leveraged relationships with China, India, and other non-Western allies who saw Africa not as a colony to be exploited but as a partner to be respected. This is why the project has Washington on edge. For years, the U.S. has tried to present itself as Africa's best friend, yet what has that friendship produced? Endless lectures about governance, loans with crushing interest rates, and aid packages that never lifted anyone out of poverty. Zimbabwe's steel project bypassed all of that and still succeeded. That sets a dangerous precedent for the West because it shows African nations that they can thrive without Western approval. But this is not just about economics, steel means sovereignty. With this plant, Zimbabwe can build its own bridges, its own military vehicles, its own railways, without having to beg or pay premium prices to the West. Every beam of steel is a nail in the coffin of dependency, and once this independence spreads, Africa will become untouchable. Already, you can see the shift in tone across African capitals. Presidents, ministers, and business leaders are visiting Zimbabwe, taking notes, forming alliances. There is talk of a pan-African steel network plants in Zimbabwe, Nigeria, South Africa, and Ghana working together to supply the entire continent. Imagine the power of an Africa that not only produces its own raw materials but also controls its own industrial output. This threatens U.S. influence because America's leverage over Africa has always been tied to supply chains. Control the supply chains, control the development. But now those chains are breaking. A continent that can produce its own steel can produce its own destiny. Western corporations are not sitting idle. Reports suggest that lobbyists are pushing Washington to increase tariffs on African steel, to block its entry into U.S. markets. But Africa has learned from the past it is no longer desperate to sell to the West. The African Continental Free Trade Area (AFTA) has opened up a massive internal market. Zimbabwe can sell to Zambia, Mozambique, Kenya, Nigeria, and 50 other nations before it even needs to look abroad. This is why Western analysts are describing this as a strategic nightmare. If Africa no longer needs Western markets, it can finally dictate fair terms. And if Africa becomes self-sufficient, the era of neocolonial control ends. The steel plant is also a magnet for new industries. Cement manufacturers, construction firms, auto assemblers, and rail developers are already setting up near the facility to take advantage of cheaper inputs. This cluster effect will turn Zimbabwe into a manufacturing hub, creating a ripple of development that will lift millions out of poverty. The West's fear is that this success will spread like wildfire. If one African nation proves it can industrialize without the West, others will follow, and the entire global balance of power will shift. This is why Western media is trying to spin the narrative, calling the project unsustainable, warning of debt traps, and even claiming that the plant will harm the environment. But these are distractions. For decades, they never cared about Africa's environment when they were extracting its minerals. Now that Africa is using those minerals for itself, suddenly the West is concerned. The truth is simple. This is about power, and Africa is taking it back. Zimbabwe's leadership has been clear. This is not just an economic project but a psychological one. For too long, Africans were told that they could not build great things, that they had to rely on the West. This plant is a monument to the African spirit, proof that when given the chance, Africans can build wonders. This is why young Africans are flocking to engineering schools, why entrepreneurs are launching startups around the steel supply chain, why farmers are excited about new infrastructure that will connect them to markets. It is about pride as much as profit, and the pride is contagious. Across the continent, you can feel the momentum. No longer are African leaders attending global summits as mere spectators. Now they speak with authority, knowing that their nations are building real power at home. The $800 million steel plant in Zimbabwe is not just a project, it is a revolution. It is the breaking of chains, the end of an era of exploitation. It is Africa's announcement to the world that it will no longer be the backyard of Western industry but a competitor, an equal, a force to be reckoned with. America is worried because it knows what comes next. Today it is steel. Tomorrow it will be automobiles, aircraft parts, microchips, and heavy machinery, all made in Africa. By Africans, for Africans. The days when Africa exported its wealth and imported its poverty are over. The furnaces of Zimbabwe will not just melt iron, they will melt fear. They will melt the myth of African inferiority. They will forge a new future where the continent stands tall, independent, and respected. The West may panic, but Africa will not stop. The world must prepare because the age of African industrialization has begun. And once the fire of progress has been lit, nothing, not sanctions, not pressure, not propaganda can put it out. This is Africa's century. This is Africa's steel age, and the world had better get used to it. The fires of Zimbabwe's steel plant still burn tonight, but they are no longer just flames in a factory. They are the flames of a continent reborn. Africa has been told for centuries that it cannot compete, that it must stay in its place, that its resources must serve others. But here we are, standing in front of a $800 million monument to defiance, to resilience, and to progress. This steel plant is not just a facility, it is Africa saying enough. Enough of exporting raw or only to buy back expensive finished products. Enough of depending on aid that comes with chains attached. Enough of living under the shadow of those who profit from Africa's pain. Tonight, the world has no choice but to pay attention. Washington is worried. Paris is watching. London is whispering because they know what this means. They know this is the first domino to fall. The plant in Zimbabwe is not an isolated victory. It is a signal to Africa that we no longer have to wait for someone to save us, we can save ourselves. Picture what this means for the future. African-built trains running on African-built trails, carrying goods made in African factories, trading with African neighbors, and selling to the world at African prices not dictated by Wall Street or Brussels. This is what sovereignty looks like. This is what freedom feels like. Let the critics call it dangerous. Let the so-called experts warn about geopolitical risks. They are only afraid because they see a new Africa rising in Africa that is not begging but building. To every young African watching this moment, understand this. The steel being forged in Zimbabwe is also forging your future. It is forging an economy where your skills will be valued, where your ideas will find a place, where your dignity will not be bought and sold for aid packages. And to those who thought sanctions would keep us down, look closely, your sanctions were the very fire that tempered us. Your pressure created diamonds. Your attempts to isolate us have only united us. This is Africa's message to the world. We will no longer be the raw material supplier for your empires. We will no longer accept the crumbs from your table. We are building our own table and our own future out of African steel. So let Washington worry. Let the headlines scream. Let the markets panic. Africa is not waiting for permission anymore. The furnaces in Zimbabwe will keep burning, and with every ton of steel they produce, Africa moves closer to its destiny, not as a continent to be pitied, but as a power to be reckoned with. The future is here. The fire is lit, and Africa is just getting started.